You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. It's starting to look and feel a lot more summery out there in Winnipeg, and whether it's anticipation of beach days or rainy ones indoors curled up on the couch, a new book is always a good idea. Thankfully, on this first Friday of June, Chris Hall of McNally Robinson Booksellers has returned to the Classic 107 studio with the latest edition of What to Read. Hello, Chris.
Good morning, Simon.
How have you been?
I've been very well, thanks. How have you?
You know what? I'm not doing half bad. I'm starting to get excited for summer, and it appears that McNally Robinson is also on the same train of thought because there's a banner image on the website that clarifies a beach read is just a book at the beach.
That's right. We have always proclaimed such things, yes.
That has me thinking, are you one of those who likes to read at the beach? Do you like reading outdoors, or are you an indoors type of reader?
No, I'll read outdoors, usually in the shade. I don't tend to read in the direct sun, but yeah, if you can get a shady spot on a sunny day, that's a great place to read.
That's true. Trees. Great place to read in the park, something like that, or, setting up the umbrella, or just even in the backyard. Yeah. Anyway, we're getting excited for it. So with this anticipation that, summer's just around the corner, we're going to begin this edition of What to Read with an author you've recommended before, right? The latest from Julia Phillips?
Good catch, yes. This Julia Phillips wrote a book called Disappearing Earth. That's what you're referring to. And yes, it was a What to Read when it came out. I still highly recommend it. Her new novel is called Bear, and it is set on an island off the coast of Washington State, and it involves two young sisters, Sam, who works in a ferry catering to wealthy tourists, and Elena, who bartends at the local golf club. Their mother lives with them, but she is suffering from an illness, and she's not expected to live very much longer. So these two young sisters, they're barely out of high school. They're struggling to earn a living. They're looking after their mother. And they're trying to figure out what they want to do in their future, and what kind of freedom they will have for that. And into this scene comes a grizzly bear. And this grizzly bear just appears. He sits on their front step. He hangs around. They get a photo of him. He doesn't do very much. He chews some siding off the front of their house, and then disappears and then reappears randomly. And the two sisters have very different responses to it. Sam is terrified, but Elena is enchanted. And this difference in responses really kind of, it catalyzes, I guess, something that's happening to them as they grow up too, and they handle all these kind of adult responsibilities a little too soon. It's very interesting. This bear kind of just, I don't know if you'd have to think about it to see, does it represent something? But it certainly has an effect on their lives, whether it's nature, whether it's priorities. I mean, it just kind of prompts them to, and then they realize that they maybe don't know each other as well as they thought. That part of how they know each other is based on something they said when they were 12. It's really a novel about growing up in lots of ways.
This has been a novel that has been highly anticipated. It was on all sorts of lists, plenty of hype around Phillips. What do you think makes her such a great writer and one to watch?
The Disappearing Earth was a set of, I guess, short stories would be one way to look at it. But they all gathered into a novel, and there's a number of novels like that I've read over the years where a community ends up telling the story. And this isn't quite a community, but this is two sisters, and this story comes together from very, very good at creating characters that you care about, that are very real, have all those little thoughts that we all have. But she gets right down into the depths.
Yeah, into the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
Well, the next pick, I'm thinking, takes us to Scotland, because I believe Caledonia is the old Roman name for the area. Is that right, Chris?
Well, it takes us to London, actually.
Right,
yeah, well, although it takes us to Scotland because Andrew O'Hagan is a Scot.
Is a Scot, yes.
So, yes, Andrew O'Hagan he's a novelist who's been hanging around the Booker Prize for many of his novels on the shortlist, has yet to win it, but Mayflies, The Illuminations, Our Fathers, they've been on the long list or short list. And so Caledonian Road is the new one. The main character in it is a man called Campbell Flynn, and he is an art historian. He's got a very successful biography of Vermeer on his resume. His world is in academia, but he's very drawn to the world of upper-class wealth. He's got some friends, and he's met some people who have a lot more money than he does, and he's really drawn to trying to make more money. So he tries to kind of take his knowledge, his academic knowledge, and write some articles and books intended for a wider audience. But his plan goes awry. His writing is not accepted on terms he thinks he intended, and instead, in this current day, people are offended by it. People are question him and challenge him, and he ends up falling kind of. It seems like almost it falls into that space between wealth and normal wealth and traditional journalism and the internet and mostly between his and a younger generation is mostly what happens. The novel, interestingly, is billed as a social novel in the Victorian style, and that had me really thinking during it. It really is. It's a large cast of characters from all walks of life. They end up, they have these conversations in restaurants and in parks, and it really does feel like a Victorian novel, but it's set in the very present day.
You mentioned author Andrew O'Hagan has been hanging around the Booker Prize. And Chris, I mean, it's early to say, but you tend to have a good pulse on these things. Does this feel like another one that might end up on a list or two?
I think this is one. I don't think it appeals to everybody, but maybe that's part of its power. It is very modern day, and it's like almost in that cringy kind of way where you kind of feel like you know what's coming, but you can't stop it. It's a very different novel from what I guess normally wins the Booker, but you never know. In a set of books from a given year, which book stands out? It's a mysterious thing.
Tough to say, of course. Yeah. Now, just as a quick little plug, this particular novel may not take us to Scotland, but you will be. Just a little reminder that there are more details at McNallyRobinson.com. The first McNally Traveling Book Club planned for next year. We were talking about it when you were last in. Very exciting indeed.
It's fun, and the bus, or shall I say the coach, is starting to fill up. So there are some people who are just as excited about it as I am. Yeah, we are going to meet 3 times in Winnipeg in the classroom at the store, talk about books set in Scotland, and then we're going to go to Scotland, and we're going to have all this reading in our background, and we'll be so knowledgeable.
They're so knowledgeable. I'm trying to pitch that the radio show should go with you in the back of the coach somewhere. But again, more details at McNallyRobinson.com as we get back to the task at hand. What's next on your list, Chris?
Next is a familiar author as well, hanging around Canadian prizes. Her name is Rachel Cusk. Her new book is called Parade, her new novel. She was born in Canada. She was born in Saskatoon, actually. She spent very little time there, and she moved to England with her parents and is largely an English person. Grew up there at this point, but she still qualifies for Canadian prizes. So she was on the shortlist for the Governor General's Award for the 2nd place and was on the Giller shortlist for her novel Transit. She really challenges what we think a novel is, and sometimes she writes autofiction, which is that blend of autobiography and fiction. And of course, as people who don't know her very well, we're not really sure what is fiction and what is nonfiction. It makes it really interesting to think about what the difference is between fiction and nonfiction. In this new novel, she really kind of goes at that divide between art and life, addresses it pretty directly. There are many allusions to art in it, situations that look like paintings and people who look like sculptures, events that happen compared to performances. And there is an artist at the center of the book. He, or maybe it's a she, they take on many pseudonyms. They're trying to avoid kind of being revealed as the creator. So identity is called in, and you're never really sure where you stand in terms of the work of art in the book. But in another section or another character, a woman is attacked by a stranger in the street, and the attacker flees, but before she gets entirely away, she turns around to contemplate as if she's just created a painting and look at the scene she has just created. It's really kind of interesting. Very heady novel, full of ideas you might have gathered, but that's what Cusk does. Yeah. And judging by the sales of her past books, there's a lot of people interested in the ideas she's playing with.
Yeah, this is her 17th book. I was doing some reading in anticipation of this, and talking about how some of her past works have really looked at the way a novel is told and turned that idea upside down. And it sounds like there's just even more of this in Parade.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So speaking of repeat what to read authors, we've got another one queued up.
That's true. Good for you. I'm getting predictable, perhaps. This is Olivia Lang, and yes, she has appeared before on this segment for a book called Lonely City. That's a few years ago now, and that explored the work of several artists in large urban cities, and they explored the art of being alone, or or being alone through art. And I just loved it. I really liked that book. And that was set before COVID, before we knew what it was like to really be alone and isolated. So this new book, she goes into the garden. The Garden Against Time is what it's called, In Search of a Common Paradise. And so she just explores the world and the ideas of gardens. It's prompted, she made a move where she bought a large 18th century house in Suffolk, and it had a large walled garden. It's kind of in COVID, or like she buys
2020
it.
thereabouts.
Yeah, she buys it like literally just before it hits. So she ends up kind of isolated, or at least restricted to her garden, to her house. And this book is about the work of reclaiming that garden. It was overgrown and struggling. But it's not just about tending the plants. She goes off into reveries, as I guess I'd call them, history and art and writing about gardens. So she takes us back to the ancient gardens of Babylon, through Milton's Paradise Lost and John Clare's poetry on English landscapes. I wasn't familiar with John Clare. And he wrote while the English countryside was being moved from commons, as they called it, to private property, and was lamenting the loss of access, etc., that he grew up with. She asks questions about who gets to live in these mini paradises and what they do to us and for us. It's no coincidence that in COVID lockdowns, gardening suddenly exploded in its popularity. We do retreat to these spaces and tend them, and nesting, I guess, is another word for it, and has happened many times with previous plagues throughout history. So it's fascinating stuff. A really great book to sit peacefully in the shade under a tree in your backyard.
Great callback there, Chris. Great callback. And yes, so that's the Garden Against Time. You're hardly becoming predictable. I should clarify. I just think I've been doing this for a while now too, and it's starting to recognize these authors because when you find somebody who works, I mean, it's just exciting to see what they produce next.
Yeah.
Now, one last sort of callback, and this takes us back years ago, as you know, an aspiring bookseller of the world, Chris. What would you be without a map of the actual world, though this one might be a little bit dated?
That's true, yes. We're back, or we're sticking with nonfiction. It's a book called This Earthly Globe, A Venetian Geographer and the Quest to Map the World, and it's by an author named Andrea de Rabelant. He is Italian. This tells the story of a man named Giovanbattista Ramusio. My apologies to Italians out there. An editor who lived in Venice in the middle of the 16th century. He took it upon himself to publish a book. He called it Journeys and Navigations, and he collected all the knowledge about the wider world that was known at that time. And then he followed that up. He published 2 more volumes. And what makes this momentous is up until that point of the 16th century, it was assumed the ancients already knew everything about the world that we needed to know. So the ancients would just be published and read and assumed that this was what the world was like. But it was being discovered at that time by explorers and writing things that came back, and so reports from the wider world, that the ancients only knew a tiny fraction of the world, and frankly, they made a lot of it up. So this is the story of a man who within a time and place, we get to visit Venice in the 16th century. So all the things that are happening there, they're constantly under threat from enemies. We get into the book publishing world at the time, which is another theme that does repeat through these segments, you will have noticed. So I found it a very fascinating immersion into a time and place and a person. And this is really where the concept of geography as we know it really came into being.
Yeah, it sounds so fascinating and absolutely wild. I found one review that called it the WikiLeaks of the Renaissance.
Yes.
And I thought that was just so well said.
He exposed the reality of what the world was.
Just absolutely. I know I say it every month, Chris, but you've certainly given us plenty of interesting picks to add to this month's reading list. Of course, you can find these books and more, many, many more, at McNally Robinson in person at the Grant Park or Forks Market locations in Winnipeg, or online anywhere at McNallyRobinson.com. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Simon.